You guys, something unbelievably cool just happened. There is actual breaking news in the field of classic literature. What a time to be alive. This is not breaking news about the stock market. It is not breaking news about the presidential election. It's not breaking news about war overseas or any of the other rather unnerving things that seem to be happening all over the world. But instead, much more fun, much more enjoyable, much cooler. It's breaking news about Greek tragedy. You never thought you'd see it. You did not think you'd live to see the day. It seemed as if this was a bygone thing of the distant past. But no, in fact, we are still digging up ancient texts that had been lost and are now found. And every now and then you get a really, really cool one. It means people have to sift through a lot of not so cool receipts, weird court orders, just stuff scribbled onto the back of various papyri. But sometimes you really hit the big one. You really strike gold. And I wanted to tell you about a particular one that just hit the presses. It was sent to me by my buddy. Shout out to Emmett Penny, the nuclear barbarian. He's been on the show. Really great guy, and occasionally comes up with stuff like this to show me. This is not actually the thing that has been most in the news about classical texts lately, and that is the Vesuvius challenge, which you may have heard about. This is not that, but just to recap, if you're aware of that or not, you should go check it out. The Vesuvius challenge is an AI application to ancient texts, and the texts in question are actually the texts that I worked on in grad school. When I was in grad school, there were only basically very advanced X-rays that people could use for these charred scrolls that were found under the ashes of Mount Vesuvius. You know Mount Vesuvius, it erupted. There was this famous city, Pompeii, that got buried under the ash, and then they found all of these people that had been running, and they were frozen forever. So now we've got these amazing, terrifying, haunting images and sculptures of people who were on the verge of death, but also a lot of preserved frescoes and mosaics and all this cool stuff. You probably know about that part. You probably saw a documentary about it in high school sometime or something like that, or maybe you are interested in it independently of school, but you might not know as much about Herculaneum, which if you go to Italy and you want to visit the ruins of Pompeii, you will probably, it will be recommended to you that you go also to Herculaneum, which is the slightly less well-known city that was also buried under the ash and therefore also has a bunch of interesting stuff, including, for word cells like me, the best part of it all, the Villa dei Papyri, which in the 18th century was unearthed and revealed to contain a whole ancient library, probably belonged to L. Calpurnius Piso, who seems to have been the patron or the ringleader of an Epicurean circle. Epicureanism was the philosophy in the ancient world that most lent itself to witty salons and well-heeled gatherings of aesthetes and artists and philosophers. It seems like Virgil might have traveled among this crew. Certainly, Philodemus, the philosopher, was part of this circle, and part of how we know that is that many of his books are in the library, in charred form. And the story of how they excavated this stuff is fit for prime time. It is so maddening and crazy and tantalizing because you start out, these guys are digging up, they don't know what they're digging up, and they're literally hacking into some of these things with knives. So a lot of stuff got destroyed tragically in the early excavation process, but pretty early on you have people ingeniously devising all of these machines to unroll them without destroying them, hanging them from wires and letting weights pull them down. And then gradually as technology advances, you get some of this X-ray stuff, technology applied to it. And there's this guy, Brent Seals, who has been very involved in what's called tomography, which is a very kind of fancy way of trying to measure the density and the thickness of the papyrus and separating the ink from just blank papyrus without unrolling the scroll itself, etc., and so on. Fast forward to the age of peak language learning models, the age of deep learning, the age of artificial intelligence and AI and whatever. This guy, Nat Friedman, takes notice of Brent Seals and the papyri and gets fascinated by this problem of what was in that library. Because as you probably know, if you listen to this show, or maybe not, all of the stuff that we talk about when we talk about ancient Greek and Roman literature is like this tiny little sliver of a glacier on the surface of the ocean, and so much other stuff was lost. Plays upon plays, philosophical dialogues, poems, you name it. There was a ton of it that just did not make the historical cut. The things got burned, things got thrown away, things were forgotten, and there was all sorts of stuff that just got totally destroyed. And then there's this whole other category of stuff that sits around waiting to be discovered because the archives are so vast and nobody quite knows exactly where to look at any given time. And sometimes you dig up stuff that you thought was lost, like the Villa dei Papyri, and then you have to figure out how to just get your hands on it, how to access it. And so these digital techniques that are being developed in the age of AI have a lot of promise for unrolling more, maybe more Philodemus, which would be sort of a letdown for people besides me who don't love Philodemus or find him fascinating. I do find him fascinating. He's already provided some interesting stuff, like an account of how Plato died and where he died, where he was buried. That's sort of interesting, but what we really want here is like the Symposium of Aristotle, the lost philosophical dialogues. We want plays and poems and all this cool, sexy stuff that we study in school, and there's a real possibility that you'll get some of that. You could get Ennius, who is the Latin epicist that really dominates the whole tradition before Virgil. You could get some of that, which has been lost, or all of it, which would be unbelievable. There's like non-zero possibilities of some absolutely amazing stuff. Hasn't happened yet. Definitely could happen. We are living in probably the most exciting time to be a classicist, to be interested in ancient literature since, I don't know, maybe even, I was going to say the early 20th century, but maybe like the Renaissance. So a lot of this stuff you think of as Renaissance era stuff, like Petrarch famously discovered the letters of Cicero randomly sitting around in this manuscript, or slightly later on you get like the discovery of the Beowulf manuscript, and we sort of feel as if like gone are the days when the really juicy stuff was just lying on the ground to be picked up, right? The low-hanging fruit, we think, has been gotten. But now, the more technology advances, the more you think, well, actually, you might just come across really great stuff. And you never know, because truly we are tiny little lights in a vast universe of darkness. We really are illuminating one little corner at a time. And the story that I have for you today kind of illustrates this, because it's not one of these fancy high-tech revelations. It's not some new thing. It's just a papyrus that they found at a dig. In 2002, Bassem Gehad, who's an archaeologist, found a papyrus at Philadelphia, not the one in Egypt, the one in America, but the one in Egypt. There's a place called Philadelphia in Egypt. It means the city of brotherly love. It's in this location called Fayum, and sent the picture of it to the University of Colorado at Boulder. You can't remove these things by law from Egypt, but there's a scholar at Boulder who's collaborating with this guy, Bassem Gehad. Her name, I'm sure I will get this terribly wrong, so I'm sorry if you're listening, but it's Ivona Turnka Amrhein. Yeah, I don't really know how to say that, but she's one of the scholars that's kind of working with some of this material. She and her advisor, John Gibert, I think that's how you say it, have figured out that one of these papyri from Fayum contains what looks very much like fragments from two Euripides plays that were lost previously. And they're still lost. We don't have the whole thing, but we have big chunks of them. And so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this will go from here on out, because if you're not deep in the weeds with this stuff, you might not know what to expect. But let me take this moment now to urge you to go to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics and sign up for their fall courses. You still have a few days to do it. The registration closes on August 10th, and you can get 10% off if you use the promo code Spencer, SPENCER, just my name, when you check out. They will teach you how to read Latin, Biblical Hebrew, Biblical Greek, and or Anglo-Saxon, depending on any of those ones that you may be interested in, and they will do so in a way that gets you reading fast. One of the problems and frustrations that people often have when they embark upon the endeavor of learning one of these ancient languages is they get into it because they want to read the Bible, or they want to read Homer, or they want to read whatever. And then for the first 4 years, all they're doing is conjugating verbs. And I don't think this is a very effective way of teaching. I was always most excited to get reading real Latin when I first started out, and I expect you feel that way too. Ancient Language Institute has got you covered. One more time, it's ancientlanguage.com/Young Heretics to sign up. Courses are the deadline is almost done, August 10th, but you can still get in under the gun, and they do have other options available after that fall course deadline as well. So go check them out, ancientlanguage.com/Young Heretics. Okay, we're going to check back in on this later down the road, because what happens next is these two scholars look at this stuff and they very, very carefully try to discern what's written on the papyrus. So the first mechanical part of it is just figuring out what the heck these things say. It's called papyrology, and it involves some pretty difficult and specialized work, because these scribes, they wrote in ways that are not the way we typically write now with our printed Greek manuscripts. So even if you know how to read Greek, there's a lot of smudges and difficulty, and then just the letters don't look the same. They don't have the same shape as they do on modern pages. And so they think they have figured out, from what I gather from reading this article on the Boulder, Colorado website, I gather that they have basically got a manuscript of the text prepared. And this is called publishing the text, because otherwise it just sits on this papyrus. It looks like this month they're going to publish their first edition of the papyrus. And then everybody going to get in an argument. Everybody going to have fun, like messing around with this or that particular word, or saying whether or not they think this really is an authentic piece of Euripides, or whether it comes from the plays they think it comes from, and so on and so forth. So full disclosure, haven't seen this fragment yet. I'm not working with these guys, so I don't know the text, but I thought it would be cool to tell you the story as a kind of one more thing from this week's episode about the Iliad. I wanted to tell you the story of one of the plays that seems to have been unearthed now. There's about 98 lines to this document overall, so a little chunk. This is the kind of scraps that we're begging from the table of history here. But the two plays are the Polyidus and the Ino. And the Polyidus one is particularly fun because it's actually directly related to the stuff we've been talking about. Not directly, but somewhat related to the stuff we've been talking about in our Iliad episodes. Because as I introduced the concept of the prophecy, which hangs over the whole poem, I was thinking about how that one concept, which really begins, I think, with the Achilles prophecy, this famous idea that Achilles is doomed. If he goes to battle, he's doomed to die young, but he will have a glorious memory, versus living his life in obscurity and dying at a ripe old age and feeling basically fine for most of his life. And what's the right choice? If you know that's your choice, what do you do? And that then becomes like spun out into this whole motif of the soldier or the warrior who knows his fate before he goes into battle. And part of me feels that this is a little bit like the story of the blockbuster movie that really goes well. So you get some movie like, I don't know, Apocalypse Now, that just does great at the box office, or Deadpool and Wolverine seems to be doing pretty well this summer. And what happens next is all the different executives in Hollywood get together and they say, wow, we made so much money on that movie. How can we make so much money on the next movie? And then they pick the most lame and ridiculous thing from that one movie that succeeded, and they decide from now on every movie is going to be like this. So you saw it with The Exorcist, where that movie is just a really great scary horror movie, and basically what they took away from it was, that means we need to be making movies about exorcisms and about young girls and about coming of age from now on. And it's like, that's not really what people connected to about that movie. Those are just the outward forms of the thing. And now you're trying to replicate that success by copying and over again. Part of me feels like that's what happened with the Achilles prophecy, that then everybody else had these copycat stories because they knew that that was a story format that had worked really well in the Iliad. And now they're going to give you all these other different stories. But also, part of me just thinks, actually, this is really a deep-seated motif in the psyche, because not only is it replicated in a bunch of later myths and stories. For example, later on down the line, it's said that Odysseus had his own prophecy, that he was going to have this long journey homeward. But even in the Iliad, there are other soldiers that seem to have prophecies associated with them. And Polyidus in the Iliad is one of the prophets that delivers one of these prophecies. His name means much seeing, of seeing many things. And so he seems to always, wherever he comes up, to be a prophet. So I'm just going to read you this short section from Iliad 13, in which Polyidus appears. He's from Corinth, and it's his son who is at war in this version of events. This is not the version that Euripides tells, but I'm just going to introduce this version so that you can see how Euripides' version differs. We're in book 13 here. This is my translation of a short passage from the Iliad in which Euchenor, son of Polyidus, dies. There was a man named Euchenor, a prophet's son. His father was Polyidus, a wealthy man and a noble one, at home in his dwelling in Corinth. He took his doom to heart long before he set foot on his ship. Again and again, the noble old Polyidus would tell him, either a wasting disease will take you here in these halls, or else you'll fall to the Trojans along with the Greeks by their ships. So this is a classic example of the mini type scene that gets replicated from the larger idea. But it's a much more tragic one because he doesn't have the option. Euchenor doesn't have the option of just sticking it out and living a pleasant, comfortable life. He's going to die one way or another. Is he going to die through long suffering at home in a disease, or is he going to die in a blaze of glory by the Greek ships? And that actually is kind of a more acute version of the Achilles choice, because it draws home the part of the point, which is, you're going to die anyway. How do you want to die? Do you want to draw this out in this long, extended suffering, or do you want to go to your grave in a blaze of glory? So that's the story in the Iliad, but it seems as if this was either an alternate version of already existing myths, or as if the myth got totally rewritten and changed, because it becomes, by the time of Euripides, a Cretan story. That is a story of King Minos on Crete. And we can find versions of it in later writers. These two major sources that we always use when we go for like the Greek myths that seem to have been passed around are Pseudo-Apollodorus and Hyginus. Hyginus is 1st century AD. Pseudo-Apollodorus is probably 1st or 2nd century also. He's pretending to be a much earlier scholar, Apollodorus, the student of Diogenes of Babylon, but it can't possibly be him because he makes references to after that Apollodorus died, so we're not totally sure who wrote this, but these are both collections of ancient myths. They sound really cool. They kind of make you want to, when I describe them, you kind of want to read them. Like, yeah, I want to read all the Greek myths. And whenever people ask me, how do I get to know all the Greek myths? Or can I give my kid a book that will tell him all these cool stories from Greek antiquity? I always want to be like, go read Hyginus or go read Apollodorus. Unfortunately, they're a little workmanlike. They just sort of tell you the story in this very flat way a lot of the time. So they're not great to just read cover to cover. They're excellent resources when you're getting to know these sorts of myths. And if, side note, you are looking for a way to practice your Latin, so if you've gone to the Ancient Language Institute or somewhere like that and you are learning these ancient languages and you want to practice your Latin, Hyginus and Pseudo-Apollodorus are great texts to use because they do tell kind of interesting stories and they use fairly simple Latin and they give you the baseline plot, which is the plot of Polyidus' story as it appears in Euripides' play. Although one of the cool things we will now discover is what are some of the ways that Euripides would have taken this story and then played with the moral implications of it. But we get the very bare bones telling in Hyginus. Basically, the way it goes is Polyidus is somewhere around on Crete, and that we know that because he's consulted by Minos and Pasiphae. Minos is the king, Pasiphae is his queen. They have a son. His name is Glaucus. And this is all very Dickensian and overdetermined because he ends up trapped in a jar of honey where he dies. Beginning of the story, dead in a jar of honey. Of the ways to go, not one of the worst, I guess. One of the tastier ways to die. But Minos and Pasiphae are obviously very distressed. Their son has gone missing. They don't know where he is. They consult the oracle. Apollo tells them through the oracle that they have a monstrum. And that's a great word in Latin, which doesn't actually mean monster, although it does refer often to sort of odd, malformed entities. But those entities are thought of in Roman religion as portents, signs and symbols to be read. And so there's a really interesting turn of phrase in Hyginus where he basically says, you have a monstrum to be solved. In other words, there's some out of the order portent that has occurred, something unusual, and you need to figure out what it means. And once you figure out this monstrum, the same person that figures this out will be able to find your son. Polyidus wins the prize. The monstrum is, it turns out, a calf that has been born in the stables that turns color every day. It starts out white, then it becomes red, then it becomes black. Polyidus figures out through cleverness and dream interpretation, I guess, or philosophical interpretation, that this is the pattern of the mulberry as it ripens, that it starts white, becomes red, turns black. He also then learns where, some sort of vision, he learns where Glaucus is. He's in this vat of honey. And this is typically how these prophecy stories kind of work, is that the prophet is somebody with access to the hidden logic behind things, who can see not just the outward monstrum, but the underlying sort of rationale. This is why the prophet is both a close kin of the poet, but also kind of a precursor of the scientist figure as well. Anyway, Polyidus figures this out. They find Glaucus, and then Minos says something very kingly, and it's kind of fun even in the Hyginus. He says, corpore invento, nunc spiritum restitue. This is what I mean. If you're practicing your ablative absolutes, you will recognize corpore invento, meaning now that you've found the body, you must restore the spirit. Polyidus says, I can't do that. That's not one of my superpowers. Minos says, in that case, please and thank you, bury yourself alive with my son. You will die along with him. Polyidus, understandably at this point getting a bit hot under the collar, casting about for a solution, suddenly notices, nick of time, along comes a snake to try to eat, he thinks, the body of the boy. Polyidus kills a snake. Lucky for him, snakes are very, very often symbols or portents themselves. They have a lot of spiritual and prophetic significance in Greek religion. This one, true to form, is dead, waits for another snake to come along, bearing an herb which revives the snake and brings it back from death. This saves the day because Polyidus is able to use that herb and resurrect the dead son, Glaucus. Everyone is happy. It's actually not the worst tragedy. It involves some death, involves some mystery, but as I've said before on this show, sometimes tragedies have relatively happy endings. This is one of them. But it will show you kind of a cool feature of Greek literature, which is how these bare bones story structures, which really do appear first in this very distant reference from the Iliad, which doesn't seem to have much to do at all with the stories that we get later on, then in this slightly more expanded but still fairly dry reporting of how this myth structure works. But the real literary game is in what the artists were able to do with it. Sort of like, we do have these things in our movie world, for example, in the modern day, where you will get, okay, so in Star Wars, they always have this particular hero that follows this particular trajectory, or even just in sci-fi generally. There are certain tropes that recur again and again. And that just seems to be a part of our common cultural stock. And different executives have tried to exploit it in different ways, in different movies, but different artists can come along and actually breathe life into these stories. And part of their success as story templates is that they have this big kind of space for interpretation and this fertility that people can take advantage of. And so you get these things where, like, I don't know if you guys saw Logan, the X-Men movie about Wolverine, or another example of this I think is the Batman with Robert Pattinson, where you have this story, the Logan, the Wolverine story or the Batman story, and you feel like it's just been totally exhausted, all the story beats, and then someone comes along and says, okay, here's a version of it in the mode of a noir detective movie, that was the Batman, or in the mode of a Western, that was Logan, and suddenly it's like, oh, these archetypal or even iconic, or you might say played out, you might say stereotypical kind of plot devices are getting repurposed and refashioned in a way that feels slightly more relevant, feels like it speaks to deeper questions of morality that are inherent, latent in the story. This is what the tragedians especially were always doing. They were taking stories out of Homer Aeschylus is rumored to have said that all of his stories were slices from the banquet of Homer, but they were getting them elsewhere from religion and from other epics like the Cypria and so forth. But then they were excavating out of them these latent questions that all great stories have. And sometimes they did so in an extremely pointed and even cynical or bitter way. And Euripides was known for this. His version of Odysseus, for example, is this totally nihilist cad with no backbone or principles. And he takes the virtue of Odysseus, that he has this silver tongue, and he turns that into something sour and ugly, because he's seeing how these Athenian virtues in his time are becoming sour and ugly under the duress of war. And so Euripides is very well known for this, for raising troubling philosophical questions behind the great old stories. He seems to be doing that in the fragment that they've just uncovered. These scholars are reporting that this is a story, or a portion of the play, in which there's a debate over whether it's ethical to raise the dead, which is pretty awesome. I'm very curious to know what sorts of things get said in this exchange. We will find out more about it as this news story develops, and you will hear it. You will not hear breaking news from me first if it's about the presidential election, or even about the assassination attempt on Trump, or revelations about the FBI. This is not the podcast to go to if you want up-to-the-minute news reporting for any of that. I commend to you the other sites that I work for, like the American Mind, if you're interested in that kind of cutting-edge drama. But you will definitely hear from me as soon as this piece is more generally available, and we can find it and read it and talk about what we think is going on in this new thing that we've just uncovered from the earth. It's a great time to be studying the classics. It's always a great time to be studying the classics, but it's especially a great time right now. Don't forget to write in and subscribe if you haven't already to rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Love to hear your thoughts, questions, comments, especially about this new thing. If you have content of this variety that you're interested in, questions that you've got about stuff like this, I'm very, very happy and eager to answer all of that. And I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.